the nth digit of Fibonacci. Probably not the best example, but it's just one you're gonna have to bear with me here. In this case, basically, when you go to calculate Fibonacci, if you can register your OpenFeature client here. We are looking for this FibAlgo feature flag, and if it doesn't exist, it's just going to run the default. So if you do not register any kind of provider, this would just run the default value. Why this is interesting is if we have a mechanism, it's either kind of manually documented saying like these are the well-known feature flag IDs, and this is the respected or the expected return value, or ideally we could actually define in code potentially the expected feature flags. You would be able to potentially wire this into a system where you could remotely control the flags without having to get in touch with like the library authors or whatever. So there's a lot of possibilities here. This one is just kind of an interesting example showing how you could make flag evaluations in a third-party library, or if you're part of like a big company with a monorepo, a package in your monorepo could include flag management that is optional effectively. So that was the point of this demo. If we were to wire this thing up into, let's say, just because this was the last one I was working on, if we look at the harness demo, we can go into here. And now all of a sudden, this code would be registered. You see it's all registering with harness. If we go to run the Fibonacci piece, so you see it's a bit slow. If we look down here, it's showing what the running the recursive algorithm here. And so it took a few seconds. So that's actually perfect. That was the expected behavior here. If we go into the UI now, one sec, and we change the default value here. So when it's on, we'll just say, we'll run this algorithm and say, okay, let's see if that worked. Not letting me save. There we go. Okay, perfect. So now we'll see that the change was pushed to the system. If we were to go ahead and refresh this one, now we're seeing that the new algorithm is in place and it calculated much quicker. So the third part of the demo is, now that we have this in place and we have a shared, basically developer-facing interface, we can also wrap that with OpenTelemetry and create spans. So if we were to look into Zipkin, so I just use Zipkin as a way to visualize distributed traces. This is just a really simple open source tool for looking at distributed traces. If you look into here and I were to run a query, we would see here's our Fibonacci one. Here's the one that took almost 5 seconds. If we were to look into it, we'll see that now there's a feature flag call here. You'll see that the call itself was actually really fast because it was just evaluated locally. What happened afterwards took quite a bit longer, but you can start to get a sense of what it actually did by looking here, seeing that harness was the provider in this particular case. This was the flag ID. It was part of the Fibonacci client library, and that the algorithm was recursive. So you can see that it was very slow. If we were to go back, hopefully we can find one that's a little bit quicker, like this one, or we're talking 3.2 milliseconds. And we look into here, and this was the different variation return type. So that was the algorithm that was run. That is basically it from the demo perspective. Was there any questions on any of that?
Yeah, just while you were saying that, Mike, this decoupling is perfect for like unit testing and CI/CD testing. Like that's an issue that comes up quite a lot, which we don't have a good answer for at the moment. Flagsmith, how people unit test their code with different flag permutations and things like that. and just being able to decouple that from our API and put in some environment variable, that's like that's super powerful as well. Like, and the design gives you that for free, which I think is a really positive point.
Yeah, that's like a really good marketing thing, right? Like I mean, that's a really good aspect of having this standard, is you can have, someone can build like a really good standard, like overridable, unit test friendly feature flagging implementation, and you can just drop it in whether you're using Harness or Split or your local internal thing. I hadn't thought of that either, but that is super neat, because I've been thinking about like, oh, we need to add something to the spec about how you can override stuff for unit testing, but you don't, you just replace the provider.
Yeah, it's actually a good use case for a provider that I thought was not that valuable. So good point. Thanks, Ben. Although you could probably even hard code it.
Pattern. It's a really good.
Oh, thanks. Cool. So let's jump right back into the presentation. And like I said, feel free to interrupt at any point if there's any questions here. But I just wanted to kind of quickly discuss some roadmap and prioritization. It's come up a few times, but really the focus so far has been on server side. I'd like to at least start or continue defining that, and pretty quickly, once we start to feel pretty comfortable with our design there, start investigating client side as well. It's similar but different in many ways, and I think a lot of people on this call understand that already. So kind of understanding where the differences lie and how we want to tackle that, I think should be, you know, a focus pretty short term. It's something that I think it's an important aspect of feature flag management overall. So it's something I'd like to look at in the very near future. I just wrote a couple languages out here. This does not mean that that would be the only ones supported, but it's what I would propose would be the first few that we would try to focus on and then expand, you know, if everything looks good. If you have other languages or your favorite language or whatever, feel free to, you know, add them, help out there in any way. But this is just, this is typically what I've seen in like OpenTelemetry, where they'd focus on these actually 3 languages for the most part, because they vary enough at least to have reasonably high confidence that the spec supports, you know, the popular languages basically.
One thing
I would say that
on the client side, mobile is a pretty different use case.
Yeah.
For especially flag matching, that I think it needs consideration.
That was going to be my big point, was iOS, Android are 2 big client-side implementations that will be popular.
Yeah,
I'd also say that like most feature flagging that I see, the majority of feature flags that I see in the wild are on the UI. So I like, there's, in terms of like how many people are using feature flags in Golang versus client-side TypeScript, or especially particularly JavaScript, the vast majority, I would imagine, would be client-side JavaScript. Is worth asking the vendors, because the vendors have got all the data, right? But it feels like if you want to go for the bang for the buck, JavaScript, and then maybe mobile. Or yeah, I don't know.
I would say, just as a brief counter argument for that, and this is purely a guess, but my guess is that the reason flags are used in client side is because it's very easy to do in a server side, because people essentially already do it with environment variables. And whilst they're done as environment variables, you are essentially treating them as flags. So yeah, they may not be using a feature flag provider, but they're still using flags in that sense.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, part of the reason I think server side is interesting in this case, because it does seem the most, I guess, ripe for like, I wouldn't say disruption necessarily, but like it could definitely benefit from some of the OpenTelemetry aspects and some of the other pieces that we had talked about. Client side, I think that's a little less obvious, but I still think we have to do it. I mean, it's part of what people would expect. It also is like the easiest way to demo something like this too. It's a very visual way of showing like this flag was just changed, and now, you know, you refresh the page or whatever, and now you can visually see the impact that that flag had.
Another question I've got is I would have assumed React would be just like entirely kind of done in userland, essentially, like on top of the spec, rather than, you know, when you've got React here, is this just kind of like a really nice example of how you do it in React, or is it actually kind of part of OpenFeature itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of struggled with that, to be honest. I put it on there because it's what seems to be the most popular at the moment. That is something that's probably the most controversial one on the whole list. So that one could easily be dropped, or just have basically documentation around how you could, use it in React could be sufficient.
Yeah, certainly there are. I mean, from our point of view, there certainly are. The React implementation is JavaScript or TypeScript. That's what it's using under the hood. There's very, very little difference between that. We may find some React patterns that we can apply and then build into the OpenFeature library sets as best practices, kind of things that's automatically done. But yeah, the actual functionality is TypeScript or JavaScript rather than React itself.
We've had we've had people ask for a React like specific library, and we've kind of tried to put it off, mainly because if you ask 5 people what the React library should look like, you'll get 5 different answers. But actually it's interesting because there might be some kind of primitives around React, like hooks and things, that you could maybe have as things for like that's not like React, but like map to React. But I think just taking on a pure like TypeScript, JavaScript initially is probably the best way to go, rather than, because like everyone's got a different opinion of how React, how it should work in React, and you just end up talking about something that you're really not interested in. It's just noise, I think. We've given in and built one, but we know that it's just, oh, you shouldn't do it like that, so if you don't have that conversation, then you don't have that argument.
I think it's a good, like, I feel like you'd end up building it entirely on top of the spec, but it's a good way of kind of validating the spec, because React has some weird kind of things that would kind of like, I guess, pressure test the spec a little bit. I think also it kind of demonstrates the value of the standard, where like, look, here's a React, like a nice, really nice ergonomic kind of like React like feeling library that can plug into anyone who's got an open feature provider, right? Because I'm sure, so CloudBees have one, I know Split have one, probably every vendor has built like basically their own kind of like mediocre attempt at a React thingy, because it's a pain in the butt, but you have to do it. But the idea of like being able to just have one, probably someone who's not associated with any of the vendors, building a really nice one on top of the standard and then having it magically work is like, I think that would, for some people, really help them click like, oh, why is this actually a useful thing? Because some people are going to like, almost certainly people are going to be like, why do you need a spec for feature flags? It's like one like method call that returns a Boolean. But so I think it's a good marketing thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great example of like, if there was a React open feature library that plugged into like our provider, that would mean that we wouldn't have to write one, which is like one of the main points that you're trying to achieve, right? We're trying to achieve for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And hopefully, ideally, in this situation, we could have, some expert in React help build this piece. I think there are probably people more willing to help on kind of a vendor neutral, open component, I suppose, as opposed to like a vendor specific one. So yeah, we can certainly chat about that one. I'll probably open up a GitHub issue around this so we can chat about, what we feel is the highest priority. Mobile's a great point, and it's something that we should kind of discuss and see what the prioritization should be of that as well. Next part was just the cloud native approach, and like I mentioned earlier in the call, did try to decouple that one. So there was it's basically the cloud native piece would be effectively just another provider, is the way I was looking at it, and we would probably focus on Kubernetes for that. Well, in terms of responsibilities, so this one is kind of open-ended, I suppose. But basically, we're still working on the API and SDK research. I definitely encourage everyone, if you haven't already, check out the research repo. Open issues, that would be the best way to track basically our conversations around different topics here. There's a few things like the public interfaces. Honestly, I don't really like what I've come up with so far, and we've had some good conversations around it already. But I think that could definitely use some love. So if there's anyone that has a strong interest around that, we could look at like the vendor landscape documentation that we have and try to figure out what would be something that we could provide that would be easy to use, handle all the use cases we care about, but still be able to plug into the existing vendors and then hopefully support future use cases as well. We have a ticket already open about context, so feel free to check that one out. But this is where, especially on the server, there's some really interesting possibilities. This one is something I think we should really take seriously. It's I think a way we can really make the feature flag experience for developers on the back end pretty slick. You kind of just get it just works because we're providing the context at the flag evaluation, and it basically would be like a tiered system where you could have like a global context. I proposed it earlier this morning, possibly like a client context, maybe a request context. So like it becomes pretty complex. So that's something that we should definitely discuss to make sure that we're not over engineering it. But there are some interesting possibilities there. And then we've already started talking about like how to handle default values, do error handling, things like that. And that's an area that I think we could definitely spend some time talking about. I think sometimes it's a little bit tricky to tell why a flag was evaluated in a certain way because the default behavior is to effectively, if something does fail, it returns the default value, but you don't really necessarily understand why. So if we could have some way of exposing more debug information optionally, potentially. Of course, maybe some of the OpenTelemetry integrations potentially help with this as well, but it's definitely an area that we should discuss. Another piece is the cloud native component. This is something that maybe Alex would find interesting if he's still on the call. And that would be something that I'd definitely like to have some feedback there. And then we need to start developing some proof of concept to just see how that would flow. The way I see it at a really high level is being able to register basically the cloud native implementation as just another provider, but do it in some automated fashion. So you wouldn't actually have to modify your code, depending on the language, likely, to have the flag evaluations happen effectively kind of automatically. And then outreach too. There was also another discussion on our Slack channel about other vendors in the space and who were still kind of missing in terms of like representation there. I've contacted some of them, but I don't have the ability to contact all of them at this point. So if you do have any connections there, it would be very valuable to at least let them know that this is what we're doing. It's completely up to them if they want to be a part of it, but I think it would be nice to at least give them the heads up that that we are working on this. And that's it. Is there any questions about any of that?
I guess with a couple of those kind of pieces, the outreach and the research on the existing vendors, it would be good to just kind of have maybe track somewhere in a Git repo or something, like who's talking to who, and who, like, because I don't know who's I've got some contacts with some of the vendors, but I don't know whether we've already talked to them or not, with the outreach piece. And then also with the spec and the research on the vendor's API, something that I think would be, as I was like looking through the code, one of the things that occurred to me is it'd be really nice to just have how all of the different existing vendors do like their the flag evaluation call, for example, because I kind of know off the top of my head for a few that I've used, but having that just like in a centralized place, I think would be really nice. I suspect like you've already done some of that, right? Like you've already kind of gone and looked at some of the APIs, but I'm not sure if there's a space for us to look at it.
Yeah, have a look at this and see if this, I'm going to put it in our chat right now. See if that is useful, or if there's information that's missing. And then, yeah, shout out to Steve.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for adding CloudBees. That was great. So
yeah,
appreciate that.
If you want to merge that PR I've raised, it's still not not been merged. But yeah, I was going to say there is already that, but it is a little bit sporadic in terms of like, here's a couple of examples. So as Pete's saying, it might be good to have kind of the the fairly common use cases of evaluating a Boolean flag, a numerical one, a string one, which are kind of the three main use cases, and things like parsing in context, and then have like how all of the different vendors implement that, so it's easy to see in kind of a grid tabular format. Because at the moment, here's a few examples, and you're scrolling up and down the document, going, I've lost where I was just looking.
That's a good point. Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Perfect. So yeah, I mean, the research is more or less there, but I think it's making it a little bit easier to digest. Would make sense. Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, I put it in the chat as well. I think we should get to a V01 of the spec rather sooner than later. And right now we focused obviously a lot on like talking to vendors and providers, but it would be nice to say, okay, this is what feature flagging API looks like. Even if it's a very rough first version, and maybe creating individual PRs for the individual methods that are in there, like rather making it this rather big one. And then having maybe a very first, maybe as you've shown it today, an implementation like maybe a file-based one. Because right now end users cannot actually try anything, and I think we should get to that point where they can at least experiment with it, and also can collect end user feedback rather sooner than later, even if it's like very simple V01 type of approach.
It would be really awesome. And yeah, in the chat I mentioned that KubeCon would be a good target. And speaking of KubeCon, there is some space at the CD Events Day on May 17th. So if there is interest to have a kind of workshop, maybe 1-2 hours for discussions, maybe some demos on site, it's possible there. But for that, it would also require some specification draft, maybe POC, to make it efficient.
Okay. All right. Yeah, what else? Is there any other items we need to discuss? I guess one thing to note, we do have a developer starting on Monday. So we'll have some additional resources that can help answer questions on, on the issues, and it can be a little bit more dedicated, to actually hands-on keyboard and, writing code and things like that. So definitely start looking at the, creating those issues, making sure that we have that conversation going, so that when, he starts up, we can really get him up to speed quickly, and we can start having tangible items that we can play with as soon as possible.
Another topic which I would like to bring up is about the Bootstrap governance. So in the chat, we tentatively said it would be March. So my question to the team is whether we are ready to initialize it, because the CNCF2C will ask about it when they review our application. But we can easily postpone it until April or May if you want to have more stakeholders joining before we really vote on these topics.
I think it would be reasonable to finish the vendor outreach before we establish governance, because I would suspect that there are some larger people in the space who would want to be involved in some of that governance, would be my guess.
Yeah, I think we can still wait a bit. There's no massive decisions are taken, but following the approach that OpenTelemetry has taken, I think they revoted most of the governance team after the first year, so the first terms are significantly shorter in the beginning, especially from the Bootstrap team. I think that's also what we have here, right?
Yes, so I can send the governance document, but in principle, we start from Bootstrap governance for 5 or 7 people, I don't recall. And then within 2 years, there is a commitment to rotate the entire Bootstrap governing board to all elected positions. So initial list will be selected by all interested parties, plain majority who joined by the time of the election. And then, yeah, this board will define the new elections. That's the plan.
I think we could still wait a bit, but I think we should establish, as we want to make this a cross company effort, to establish rather sooner than later. I think we can wait maybe a couple more weeks, but it wouldn't wait too long. It would probably make rather the first terms significantly shorter, and maybe even give the board the opportunity, like the Bootstrap board, to run an election even earlier if they say that it's a good idea. That's something I would add in there. If they decide, for example, to do it by the end of the year because way more people have joined and contribution structures have changed, I think that would be fine as well.
Works for me.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
So if we were going to coordinate on which vendors we've talked to, where would we put that information? I'm looking at the repositories that I see, and I'm not clear on where to start that thread.
That's a good question.
Like community question mark?
I would put it in community, like community outreach. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a good point of a share who we talk to.
That would make sense. Yeah.
Just as GitHub issues.
Yeah, that would be fine, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to include in that outreach, do we want to include open source tools as well? It occurs to me there's a few, and they're kind of obviously very kind of like tech stack specific, but there's a few kind of open source feature flagging libraries that have been around for donkey's years, some of them. But so they've probably got some interesting, got lots of interesting experience to bring, and also would probably be interesting to build providers on top of.
Yeah, I think let's collect the list maybe, and then define who we reached out to. Just putting it in there as a doc and then just filing PRs of who we should, then we have a complete list of who we talk to, who we want to talk to.
Yeah.
And so people can also engage with us. Maybe on the outreach topic, so far we have obviously, and by we I mean the folks from on the Dynatrace side have done a lot of the outreach. I also don't want to exclude anybody from like being part of the presentation. Just wondering how we should coordinate when we engage with others, like who wants to be actively part of the presentation. That's pretty much the presentation that Mike did right now already. So maybe put in who wants to reach out to specific other companies, and then let's try to find a meeting time slot. It's usually hard if everybody wants to join. But when we have the companies there, you can specify who already has contacts with them and who wants to join the outreach, that we can then set up the proper meetings. I think that was just a very long way of saying, let's get the list together. Everybody mentions who they know, and then we get those people together and try to coordinate meetings with them. Sorry.
Sounds good. Perfect. Yep. Looks like Justin's already put it out there too. So cool. All right. Anything else?
The stuff that's there so far looks really good. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, hopefully we can, and I appreciate all the conversation around that too. I think that's how we can make this thing, work really well. I mean, there's a lot of different use cases, a lot of representation from different groups here. So I think that will hopefully lead to a good outcome here. And I think like after seeing how it can, how a provider can be injected kind of like out of the main like code base, I think that unlocks some really interesting possibilities. So start thinking about different use cases around that too. If we can have a better story about how you could use feature flagging in like open source tooling and, third-party dependencies and things like that, I think that could be even another aspect that is completely, I guess, untapped by in existing feature flag systems, because most people aren't going to roll proprietary feature flags into, a public library, for example.
There is some prior art there. I know in the node space, there's kind of like a semi-convention around debugs where you set like an environment variable that's like debug : library name or something like that. And so that might be an interesting thing to look at just in terms of how that's been done.
For logging, yeah, exactly. But I can see even for something like, I don't know, if we have a database driver or something like that, and there's some changes being made, it would be potentially interesting if you could do it, like make those changes only affect a certain user, depending on the situation. Obviously, that's not going to be a universal solution. But.
No, I mean, like I'm somewhat skeptical on it being used for like open source libraries, but for like internal migrations, I think this is like a super common use case, right? Where some platform team is maintaining the library that everyone uses to talk to like Kafka instance or whatever, and they want to upgrade, and they want to do that in a controlled way. That's like a total game changer. I think even at big companies, they don't have the maturity to kind of do that in a really controlled way. So the idea of being able to use like that baggage idea or something like baggage, and being able to try upgrading some team's library perform this migration to some team and then roll it back without having to coordinate a bunch of releases is super compelling. I think I haven't really seen anyone doing that using like in a really managed way using feature flags. Maybe some giant companies do, but yeah.
I think I could definitely see like environment variables quite often get kind of, I mean, we've got like way too many and they kind of get abused, but there's kind of no other solution to that. If there was parts of an application that had this plugged in, but just had a flat file data store of flags that you could then, you could just use it like that if you wanted to, but you could then, plug in something more elaborate down the line. Like, I think that's that's really interesting, rather than just shipping your code that doesn't work unless you configure like 15 environment variables the right way. I definitely think I think there's like the reference implementation backed by a flat file or something. I think it has a lot of potential. And like then saying, okay, I'm going to decouple that and provide like a Terraform provider for these values or something like that, so that then I've got all the IOC, like there's just, but just having that, because you've got that built in from the start, you're not having to re-engineer everything just to do that. That's really, really valuable. Yeah,
having that smooth upgrade path from just like flat files or environment variables through to like a dynamic thing. Also, the idea of eventually not having to like roll your own and declaring defeat and going and using like one of the open source things or one of the vendors would be a big benefit to the industry, because there's way too much time is spent building internal feature flagging systems that are not.
I'm curious how we're thinking about configuring these various like backends. Like the API that we have right now for getting a client is like provide a string, which feels a lot like the logger name or something like that, versus like I need to provide an API token and I need to want to swap the implementation from A to B, and we have libraries that need to be able to know this stuff.
So go ahead. I have a strong opinion that you shouldn't make the person who is evaluating the flag, the point of flag evaluation, you absolutely shouldn't make those people be aware of like what the reason behind the decision is unless they have to. So for me, I think it's a lot of value in the dev, just the person who's like creating the if else statement or whatever says, if it's on, do this, if it's off, do that. I don't care what the rules are. I don't care if it's a canary release or it's like a premium feature. or whatever. I just need to call this thing. And so to me, that points to at kind of boot time or whatever, just like you would kind of configure your OTel thing, you would configure more than one provider potentially, and have them wired up in some magical way so that they're able to decide. Like I go to the provider and say, should I show the 1-day shipping, right? So let's say a really good example like that. Should I show free shipping? And initially that feature flag is controlled by like a rollout because it's a new feature and we're not sure if we want to use it or not. So we're doing it like a release toggle. Eventually, we're going to migrate that to be something that's like a permissions thing or like a premium customer thing. But I don't want to go back to the code and change it from like, is feature on blah, blah, blah to is permission on blah, blah, blah. I just want to know, should I show this thing or not? So the idea of being able to, the dev that's writing, that's at the point of the decision, not having to think about that at all. And you can kind of repoint the decision from a release toggle type thing that like a product manager is looking at to a permissions or kind of premium feature type thing that's powered by knowledge of the customer. I think that's really an important thing to get right, because if it's like a kind of key concept in the semantics of how the spec would work. I don't know if that makes sense.
And you brought up the idea of multiple providers. We should talk about that maybe in a GitHub issue, but I don't see how that would work. But you could potentially wrap multiple providers in a single provider, if that makes sense. So that like you'd have to make the decision in that like wrapper effectively, like which of the backend providers would win.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Yeah. That's what, like, I think if you put enough kind of a few key features into the spec around being able to ask a provider like, hey, do you even know what this flag is? Then you could build that kind of like multiplexing provider basically like in user land and kind of plug it into to like you could give it to kind of like the actual kind of like the implementation provider. So like in my example, like whatever is the feature flagging system that's doing release management, and then the other kind of internal system that's doing like permissions of like, is this person a premium customer? And then you've got the multiplexing thing on top. And when you say, hey, is this feature, should I show 1-day shipping, free shipping or whatever? It goes to each of them in turn and says, hey, do you know about this flag? Do you know about this flag? And then, then you can kind of, you've got like that kind of composability. I feel like maybe I'm getting a little bit excited and over engineering things, but I have a big passion about I just see so many code bases where they've got 3 or 4 different feature flagging things, and everyone's like, oh, is it this kind of flag or this kind of flag? So it would be really nice.
We have that set up internally in eBay, and it's something we're trying to remove. And
like, you know, almost always what people should do is have an internal abstraction over all this stuff, and that you just ask it that stuff. For some reason, everyone always just uses the library directory or the vendor directly, which drives me bonkers. But being able to just kind of have a thing out of the box, sometimes you just need to give someone an existing tool that encapsulates that strong opinion, and then they'll kind of do the right thing from the get-go.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I think you need some semantics in the spec to be able to power that. So rather than just, so for example, today, I can't do like a kind of a peek of like, is this feature on? Is it something you know about? If it's not, don't send any like telemetry. Don't like throw an exception. I'll just move on to the next one, right? Like the difference between like evaluate this feature versus could you evaluate this feature would be kind of like required if you wanted to do this multiplexing thing in a kind of effective way or efficient way.
You evaluate the feature, and then you can use that like reason that you get back of like how it made its decision to kind of drive some of that also.
Yeah, I have a few ideas around that. So maybe it's something we could take up in a GitHub issue or something and kind of go through a few use cases. And I do think it ties back to Justin's point about having probably better data about why a flag was, made the decision it did. If you could do that, and then you could basically combine multiple providers, theoretically, you could really make some pretty intelligent decisions on which flag kind of wins in a scenario.
Yeah, and then you could build some nice, like more kind of for the happy path case, some more kind of nicer ergonomics thing where you just say, is it on, true or false, throw an exception if I'm asking about something you don't know about, whatever, but like the underlying kind of more powerful, richer kind of API is powering that.
Makes sense. Yeah, if you want, please open an issue, then we can chat about it there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Like if you're changing your backend provider, you then want to be sure that you're not going to, you'd want to be able to test that somehow.
Like feature flag, like a feature rollout of the rollout system.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, like is the how badly is this, data mismatching with each other, kind of like almost a meta thing, but yeah, that's maybe down the line.
That's a very meta thing.
As an action item for, I think the next meeting, because we meet every 2 weeks, is that right? I'll reach out to some internal eBay people. So I'm involved in a thing in eBay to like build feature flagging. And there's a very large mobile use case where they have a very complicated system. I'll try to get some requirements from them about what they're doing and bring it to discussion, because they have a lot of like caching concerns. Specifically, like I know some of them are, you get a set of flags just based on the app version you are. And so that very early, and it's highly cacheable information. And then there's also some like, I am Justin Abrams who lives in Portland, Oregon, levels of information that is not very cacheable. And so being able to differentiate between those types of things and kind of what their structure is, I'll get some information on that. Yeah,
there's like this whole spectrum of dynamism from like at build time we know it, to like at install time we know it, to like at boot time we know it, to like at operation time or request time or something we know it. Right? I just purely out of personal interest, I would love if you could find out how many feature flagging systems are running in eBay, because I bet it's like over 50. No, it's got to be more than that.
4 if you count config, but yeah, there's not many.
I'm shocked. I'm impressed. Good job, eBay.
There's one very large one for mobile. There's a experimentation world. There's a thing that sits in front of both of those, so you get a consistent answer between the two.
There you go.
And then there's config.
I'm impressed.
No, cool. Yeah, we're just about out of time. Any last thoughts? Definitely feel free to open up issues. I think that would be a really great place to discuss a lot of the topics that come up. So, anything else? Cool. Looks like we may need potentially a scribe if anyone's interested for next time. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Justin. Cool. All right. Anything else?
It was a good meeting.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I guess we'll see everyone in a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's great progress, Mike. Well done.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Talk soon. Bye.